Hi, I'm Cyberman Alpha, and in today's video we're going to be doing a retrospective on the Doctor Who historical stories. So how this is going to work is we're going to look at the classic pure historical stories, and then move on to the other type of classic Doctor Who historical story. Then we're going to look at the different new series showrunners and see how they've tackled their historical stories until getting to present day historical stories. So the first type of Doctor Who historical story we're going to be looking at today is the pure historical. Now these ran from the Hartnell era to the beginning of the Second Doctor era until they were eventually dropped in favour of historical stories with alien intervention. Now the reason for these stories' existence is that the original idea for Doctor Who was that it was going to be an educational programme for children. And that's why it aired at a time children could watch it, and it was originally broadcast as a children's programme, not the family fun time it has become today. But the original idea is it was going to alternate between stories set in the past, with no alien intervention and pure fact to teach children, and stories set in the future with alien intervention. And we got a number of these stories. However, this turned out not to be the case. And by the time of the Second Doctor's second story, the Highlanders, the pure historicals have been dropped altogether in favour of alien-based historical stories. But this was very interesting, and I think it's something a lot of Doctor Who fans wanted to bring into the modern series. And these stories were really fondly remembered by the cast, with William Hartnell saying the Reign of Terror was his favourite Doctor Who story of all time. And Sidney Newman, who was the original creator of Doctor Who, was insistent that there be no bug-eyed monsters in it, and that these historical stories would be purely historical. However, I can see why they did drop the pure historicals in favour of alien-based historicals. However, some of these historical stories are really enjoyable, but depending on the time period, some of the historical stories lacked in the thrill and fun of the alien-based stories, which is why they were eventually dropped. And the Gunfighters had the lowest ratings for Doctor Who at that time, with Don't Shoot the Pianist, and that was a pure historical set in the Western times. And I can ultimately see why they dropped these in favour of I can clearly see why they dropped these pure historicals for the alien-based historicals we had throughout the remainder of the classic era. By the time of the Third Doctor era, we were introduced to a new type of historical story, but historical stories in the Third Doctor era and subsequent Doctors eras were a lot less common, seeing as the alien-based outer space stories and future set stories proved to be more popular than these historical ones. But in the classic series, pure historicals, it was more centered around a famous person or event in history, with the Doctor and his companions being the only alien intervention in the story. However, in the Third Doctor era and subsequent Doctors eras, the historical setting was more of a sideshow for a massive alien plot to take centre stage. The main Third Doctor historical story was The Time Warrior, which was about the Sontaran Lynx, and he just happened to be in the Middle Ages, and it didn't make much of an impact on the story overall. With the Fourth Doctor, it was very, very similar to the Third Doctor, as he didn't have many historical stories either, seeing as the alien-based outer space / future set stories were still proving to be more popular. And it's very surprising, seeing as Tom Baker was the Doctor for 7 years, that he barely had any historicals, but they followed the same Pertwee tropes of alien invasion and the historical setting mainly being a sideshow for the bigger invasion. And by the time of the Fifth Doctor, historical stories were almost dropped completely, with, I believe, his only historical being The Visitation. Somebody can correct me in the comments section if I'm wrong. I probably am. And this is very, very surprising. But it makes sense due to the fact that, again, the future set, alien world, alien-based stories were proving to be a lot more popular than these historical stories. But it's sort of a shame, seeing as the main original idea for Doctor Who was that it would be a educational program, and it would have been nice to see some of that original concept in the newer stories that were coming out. And as we got around to the Sixth Doctor, I don't believe he had any historical stories. These were all replaced in favour of alien-based stories, primarily alien-based, and the Trial of a Time Lord story arc. And this is very, very sad, seeing as it's again going away from what Doctor Who was originally supposed to be and what made it so popular in the 1960s. However, at the time of the Seventh Doctor, we did get a few historical stories, and these were more historical-based historical stories, as it interwove historical characters and historical themes with alien plots and the alien menace coming into this story, which is very nice, seeing as at the end of its original run, Doctor Who did sort of go back to its roots and what made it so popular in the 1960s. But this was a shame, because the Seventh Doctor only got 12 episodes, or stories should I say, meaning that we could have possibly got more historical stories and more stories back to the roots of Doctor Who if it had been on longer. But as we know, it got cancelled in 1989, but it did get brought back in 2005, so that's what we're going to talk about now. Doctor Who was back. It was 2005 and there was a new showrun, a new cast, new everything. But something that they brought back was the historical stories for Doctor Who, which was very good, seeing as we needed more historicals to flesh out that this is the original Doctor Who you saw back in the 60s, the 70s and the 80s. But the Russell T Davies, the historical stories, were very different to the ones in the classic era, and even the pure historicals we'd seen. These sort of focused on a big event or character or person in history, but interweaving an alien menace into that, rather than having an alien menace and then the historical setting be a sideshow for the rest of it, or the pure historicals we saw in the 60s. This was a very clever storytelling technique, meaning you could get across the historical aspects and have it historical based, whilst also having an alien menace to keep those people who like alien menaces above historical stories very happy. And I think this format really worked for Russell T Davies, although the historical stories in this era tend to be a bit weaker than they had been in the past. But The Empty Child and the Doctor Dances is a historical story that is an example of a great Russell T Davies historical story, although written by Stephen Moffat. It was in the Russell T Davies era. Same with Girl in the Fireplace, another Moffat historical story, which was a very, very good historical story, interweaving a famous person into an alien menace and having a reason for aliens to land where famous people are. And this is very good that Moffat was good at writing historical stories, seeing as he would become the next showrunner and completely change the format of the show while still keeping the historical stories in his run as showrunner on Doctor Who. The historical stories of the Stephen Moffat 11th Doctor run are very similar to the Russell T Davies era, in that they focused on a historical person or event and interwove an alien menace into that. However, in some of the Doctor Who stories in his run, like Vincent and the Doctor, the alien menace was a sideshow instead of the historical setting, so they could focus on the main historical character of that story. In this case, it would be Vincent and the Doctor. This is why stories like this work so well, as you really get to understand the character of Vincent in this story and his struggles, and you really get to relate to him. However, in subsequent stories, such as A Town Called Mercy, it was almost making the Doctor into a historical figure, which I don't really have a problem with, but he goes back into the Wild West and becomes a sheriff. And it's almost like they're pushing the historical aspect back to a sideshow for the alien menace, although this isn't as bad as it was in the classic era. Another story earlier in his run was Let's Kill Hitler, and this, while including historical characters like Hitler, it was sort of a sideshow for the Teselector and part of Moffat's grand plan to set up the Wedding of River Song and his grand Series 6 finale arc. However, when we get to the 12th Doctor, his approach changes slightly. This is why I'm talking about them separately. So, in the 12th Doctor era, his first series, Series 8, you get a historical story, The Robot of Sherwood, which focuses on a historical figure in Robin Hood, although may just be a myth and not actually real, is taking cues from a historical story, meaning the historical aspects have been pushed to the front, but not in the way we've seen before. And I really like this aspect of it. And he also, in later historical stories, when we get to Series 9, we get The Girl Who Died and The Woman Who Lived. Instead of focusing it on an existing character that we've seen before and an existing historical person, he focuses on making his own historical figures and characters in that time. And it works really well as we get to understand these new characters which we don't have any prior information about. As in The Girl Who Died, we get information about Ishilda and her family and all those Vikings. And in The Woman Who Lived, we get information about the highwayman and the state of the people in that time. Although those two stories aren't the best two stories, they do a good job of putting historical aspects to the top and making their own believable, real characters. However, this again changes very slightly for Series 10, where you have Thin Ice, where you put an alien menace into a place where it really shouldn't belong, but make characters in that world aware of the alien menace. And it works really, really well, as again, Moffat, although not a Moffat written story, is making his own characters in the children and making them feel really real. And with the other historical story, if you can count it as a historical story, The Empress of Mars, this again changes things up by taking a concept of the Victorian soldiers and putting them on Mars, but not modern day Mars, not future Mars, past Mars, where the ice warriors existed. So this is a good way of having a reason to blend historical and alien threats together, and works really well, as this is very believable, seeing as if you were in the Victorian times and you stumbled across a spaceship, I'm sure you'd have a look at it as it would be wondrous technology to you. And he does a good job again, although this is a Mark Gatiss written story, of making characters that feel real and with some proper motivation. And the one character I particularly like, who stays with the Ice Warriors at the end, I particularly like his characterization, as we really get to understand some of these characters in the Moffat era. Finally, we get to the 13th Doctor Chris Chibnall era. Now, the first historical we got in this era was Rosa, in my opinion one of the finest New Who historical stories. And this worked so well, because it, although not a pure historical, it went back to the original ideas for Doctor Who, and had real life people and real historical figures, and everything about it actually happened. And it did have Krasko as an alien menace, but he was merely a sideshow, and it was almost a pure historical. However, Krasko functioned as a reason to get the Doctor into Montgomery so we could see this amazing event unfold. And this works so well, as we don't need this alien menace. We understand that it's a sideshow, and we're not interested in Krasko as much as we are the story of Rosa Parks, which is how these historicals should be. And it takes a modern day known event from the past and twists it up and gives you its idea from a new perspective. The same with the Demons of the Punjab, which took the event of the partition of India and put the alien menace, as we find out it's not a menace, as a very much sideshow, so we can understand these characters and get to know these characters. And the aliens in that story work really well, as we find out about a historical event that not everyone's aware of, and these aliens are aware of that fact, and they almost live in our world, not the world of Doctor Who, and they're aware that people who died need to be recognised. And I really like this Chibnall way of doing historicals. Obviously we get the Witchfinders as well, which revolves around King James, although it doesn't revolve around a big historical event, revolves around a big historical theme of witch trials. Again, this works really well, as King James is very believable, and it's all believable that they might think the Doctor was a witch. And I really like this way of storytelling, and I don't know if you like this way. If you like Series 11, you probably like this way. If you don't, I'm not so sure. But for me, this is the best way of telling historicals for the modern audience. And that brings to a close this Doctor Who historical retrospective. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like so I know you like this video. And please consider clicking that subscribe button, as it really helps me out a lot. And if you'd like to see more retrospectives or want to suggest a video idea, please leave it down in the comment section below. And please subscribe to my good friend DX Saturn Plays XD00. I'll leave a link to his channel down in the description below. He's a small YouTuber like me, trying to get more subscribers, and he'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to him. I've been Cyberman Alf. I upload videos every Sunday, so tune in when they come up. But from me, for now, it's goodbye.